Welcome, everybody. So good to see all of you here. And today we are very honored to have two amazing scholars to chat with us a little bit more about Israel as our way to celebrate. Um, Given what the sunset looks like, we're kind of still in that fading moment of Yom HaAtzmaut. For sure, in Israel already, they might be asleep, depending on how hard they're partying the whole day, or protesting, because that's how a lot of people celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut today as well. And the idea for today, the framing that we are giving to this conversation is that as a way to celebrate Israel, we are learning about what happened, what is happening right now in particular. And as Jews, we like to complain, we like to criticize. It's part of our ethos, it's part of how we do. And it's also the way we show love. Imagine a traditional Jewish mother, right, telling their kids how to do and what to do and all of that. That's pure love, right? And that's also a way in which we approach talking about Israel as well. I want to get us started by sharing a little bit on my own perspective and also drawing from a very interesting text written by Rabbi David Golinkin this week. For those who don't know, little David, as he was known here more than 50 years ago, was a member of a time, had his bar mitzvah here. His father, Rabbi Noa Golinkin, was our rabbi in the 50s and 60s. And David became Rabbi David Golinkin, very famous rabbi of the conservative Masorti movement in Israel. And he wrote a Israel at 75, a 50-year retrospective. So he tries to look back into some things. And he divided his text in a couple ways. And I want to share two sides of what he brings to this conversation, which is, in what ways have we succeeded? What are things that we have succeeded as the Jewish state in that enterprise, in that crazy project to imagine, right, 75 years ago that this was just happening? He writes way more than that, but I want to focus on a couple that were meaningful to me as well. As I was praying today also on Yom HaAtzmaut, I was thinking a lot about the revival of the Hebrew language and how unique it is for a language that maybe for some was considered completely dead and maybe relinquished to a unique element of religious services. And today, Israel is a modern and vivid language that keeps changing and actually adding more and more English into it. For those who don't know, Tikva Shesh has a very interesting song called Safa Kasha, that Hebrew is a hard language to learn because it has a lot of strangerisms, in particular from English. But even with that, right, the miracle of having Hebrew as a spoken language today, I think is one of the things to really be proud that I always celebrate when it comes to Israel. The other thing that I find very interesting that he names is something called Jewish time and space. Israel is the only place of the year that spring break actually happens on Pesach. It doesn't depend on when Pesach falls this year, right? But spring break is Pesach and fall break is Sukkot, right? It's a country where the weekend is Friday and Saturday and Sunday is a regular day, right? So the ability to live in Jewish time and space is such a unique opportunity that for some of us who look into our tradition and sometimes try to imagine what that would look like, here it is. Israel is a place where we can live in that framework that I find very interesting. The other element that I want to mark as one thing that I'm very proud, and I think our guests today are proof of that, is academia. Israel is known for one of the highest levels of academics, and for not just in numbers, but also in quality. The universities in Israel It's something that out of Jewish values is something that we really invest on, and we are very proud of the achievements that we have in all kinds of science that come through all of that. Rabbi Golinkin then goes to say, and what are places there where we have not succeeded yet? What are the challenges that we still have to go? And that's why we brought the experts to tell us a little bit more about that, because we need to solve. We have 75 more ahead, but we can start with maybe the next 25 or something like that to see where we're going. Definitely all the armed conflict, whether with Palestinians and other peoples around, and the relationship with our neighbors is definitely a struggle that we're still having, since they minus something, right? It's a problem that started even earlier, before the state of Israel. And despite some progresses in some areas, as a whole, right, it's still a major challenge for the society, something that we have not found a solution that works on that. The other part that I think, especially from us as progressive liberal Jews living in the United States and in our relationship with Israel, the aspect of religion is actually very interesting. We still don't have religious pluralism in Israel, not even within the Jewish community, right? It's very hard for us as conservative Jews who usually pray together, men and women, and how many spaces can you find like that in Israel, right? And the places that are even supported with tax money also is usually Orthodox places. The challenges that we have with the Haredi sector and the weight that it has in Israeli society, without having them necessarily in the workforce, in the army, and so on. So the religious aspect of being a Jewish state, being Jewish doesn't mean just religiously Jewish, but Jewish in a broader sense. But the religious aspect of that is definitely one of those things that I think for me is still very challenging. And the last one that I want to mention that I think is something that I would love to see in the future is Jewish education. Jewish education in Israel is not great. And you might say, well, but they speak Hebrew. Yeah, but they don't know how to read the Torah, right? It's a different kind of Hebrew. They don't really necessarily have that kind of training in particular to look at that. And even when they read the Torah, I don't think that that's where we should be focusing on. Unfortunately, most of the Jewish education in Israel is actually focused on Tanakh, on Bible, knowing the biblical history of Israel. And I would love to join many other educators who already said that publicly in many forums. Israel, if they want to teach Jewish education, they should be teaching more Talmud and less Torah, because Talmud is how we actually practice our Judaism today. We don't live in the biblical Judaism, but a rabbinical Judaism. And that is a Judaism that has dialogue, that has debate, that has multiple opinions coexisting with each other. It's a Jewish vision that is way more plural, that is going to help us get into that kind of pluralism and unity that we are looking for, while the biblical kind of Jewish education sometimes try to focus on another aspect that is more focused on a narrative, on a story. And I believe that for the success of a future Jewish education, we need to look into other Jewish texts as well. This is just a little bit of my own introduction on how I am seeing and struggling and thinking about Israel in particular today. And now I want to first invite our very own Debra Shushan, who is a member at a time, to introduce herself, and right after Dr. Noa Balf as well. And I'll let them introduce themselves the way that they want to be introduced, because they are amazing, and I'd love to hear from them how they would share.
Thanks, Rav Natan. So hi, I'm Debra Shushan. It's great to be here among family, both my Eitz Chaim family, but also my actual blood relations. My parents are actually on this call right now, which is wonderful and amazing. There they are, Maury and Rena Schulman, joining us from sunny Southern California. You can tell the lighting is a little different from where they are. So that's awesome. And many of you will know that I am the wife of Mike Shushan. I'm the mother of Ezra and Layla Shushan, who are both students in religious school at Eitz Chaim. In fact, Mike is en route now, bringing the kids home from Hebrew school. So at some point, you'll probably hear hordes and lots of noise and things like that as the mishpocha comes home from the shul. So now, otherwise, what do I spend my time doing besides being a wife and mom? Professionally, I work for a Jewish organization called J Street, which some of you may have heard of. It's a Jewish organization that is active in American politics on the issue of Israel-Palestine in particular, and works to change and transform U.S. policy on this issue. Which I won't focus on in this conversation, but basically my day job is spending my time reading and writing and learning and teaching and talking about all of this stuff, which is quite a privilege to be able to do that. Before I came to J Street, I worked at another organization in this space called Americans for Peace Now, which is the American sister organization to Shalom Achshav in Israel, which is the Israeli peace movement, which was founded over 40 years ago as Israel was in the process of negotiating peace with Egypt. So a historic and important organization that is still quite active in Israel today. And before that, I was an academic. I actually taught for 10 years at the College of William and Mary here in the great state of Virginia. That's how Mike and I first relocated to Virginia. And so that's a little bit about me and my background. And so now I'm going to toss it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Noa Balf, who's kind enough to join us here today. So Noa, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. First, let me just say thank you so much for allowing me to join your space and your community. And I look forward to talking to you more about Israel and what's going on. As Rav Natan and Debra said, my name is Dr. Noa Balf. I'm originally from Kibbutz Magan Michael in Israel, and I came to the United States for college and have been here basically on and off since. I did my PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park, and was affiliated with the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. I'm now a visiting assistant professor and teaching an Israel Institute teaching fellow at the University of Kansas. So I am in the Midwest. That's where kibbutznikim go these days. They go to the Midwest. And I teach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli society, Israeli government and politics. My research has focused on actually gender and politics, specifically focusing on the Knesset, on women's representation, legislative activity, and gender-related legislation. And so I look forward to talking more about those issues with you. Thank you.
So I'll pick it up from here and start bringing us to the history of the past couple of years. And when we get to the hard stuff, I'll throw it back to both of you. So for those who don't remember, about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, Israel was going through election season, right? And it happens once in a while. Usually in Israel, it should be every 4 and something years. But then something happened. We had like a second round right after that. That was kind of like not something usually that happens. And after that, we maybe thought that would be okay. But then we had a third round and a fourth round and a fifth, right? So we have been in the past 3 years through election season more than maybe it should be in a decade of Israel. And that changed a little bit the situation on politics in Israel. And in my opinion, actually, it made Israeli politics a little bit more extreme. It kind of polarized in two sides, one trying to fight the other, who is going to get the leadership and the coalition. While Israel was a place that when I was teaching it, especially to Americans who are used to a bipartisan model, right, that we have so many parties, right, and so many ideas coexist and so on, that faded away a little bit, and we started to see a little bit of things changing. I want to start with you, Debra. What can you explain to us about what happened since then? What is happening right now in Israel? And then we're gonna hear Noa as well.
Israel is in, an incredible and unprecedented moment. Here we are at 75 years into Israel's existence. To frame it, I would say this. One huge accomplishment that Israel has achieved 75 years in is that Layla's waving at me they are back. They're back from Islam. Excellent. 75 years in, whereas Israel from its beginning was obviously a fledgling state that faced existential threats from outside. That's no longer the case. Israel no longer faces, now I'm not saying that it doesn't face any threats at all, but it is no longer existentially threatened in the way that, say, before the 67 war, people were wondering, who was the last person who was going to turn off the lights before everybody was ejected into the sea, right? That's no longer the case. But what so many Israelis feel today is that there is a very serious threat to Israel, and particularly to Israel's democratic nature. And that is coming from inside the state. And so for 16 weeks now, incredibly, every single Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, there have been huge demonstrations. By some estimates, sometimes there would be 5-7% of the Israeli population that was, in various parts of the country. The hugest protests were always in Tel Aviv, but huge percentage of Israelis out on the streets protesting, translating, if you juxtapose it to here in the United States, where we have a much larger population, you'd be talking about like 20 million people on the streets across the country. I mean, it's a truly incredible and extremely impressive level of mass mobilization. And the reason that it's happened is because so many Israelis feel that there is an immediate and existential threat to their way of life and to Israel's existence, not its existence period, but its existence as a democracy, right? And so that's huge, right? This is the moment that we're in now. How did we get here? Right, just to talk about a little bit about what that specific threat is. Okay, so now just a little bit of background, and I'm sure Noa will probably add some great insights to this. The last election that Israel had back at the beginning of November, finally there was a conclusive result, right? After all of these successive elections that Rav Natan talked about, in which no single coalition was able to form that would have a majority of seats that would be stable. Finally, the pro-Bibi coalition was able to coalesce, right? And the key is that this is a wholly and entirely right-wing coalition, right? So you have the Likud party, which is the biggest member of the coalition. That is Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister's party. But then you have 4 other parties. And among those parties, you have ultra-Orthodox parties on the one hand, and you also have the religious Zionist parties that came together as a conglomeration. And those are really the ultra right wing, and include among them figures in Israeli politics that were previously beyond the pale. So you may have heard some of these names. I'm talking about people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, people like Bezalel Smotrich, who have incredibly powerful positions in this government. They lead ministries. In the case of Bezalel Smotrich, he's both the finance minister and he's an additional minister in the Defense Department, in the Defense Ministry, rather, and essentially is the first ever Israeli civilian governor of the West Bank, which is a whole huge topic and a pretty damn big deal. And then you have Itamar Ben-Gvir. This is a guy who is a Kahanist, right? This is someone who, I mean,
indicted for inciting terrorism.
Indeed, he has I mean, this is a man. Thank you, Noah. This is a man who had such a rap sheet that he was not allowed to serve in the IDF. And literally, I'm not making this up. He is the national security minister in this government, a man who was not allowed to serve in the IDF because of his police record. I mean, it is pretty incredible and mind-boggling. Okay, so anyway, that's our government, right? Our extreme right-wing government. Now, here's the interesting thing. This government, while during the campaign, it talked a little bit about the issue of the judiciary and judicial reform, but it wasn't like it wasn't a central issue. It wasn't a main campaign issue that the parties were debating and that Israelis felt like, to my understanding, that they were actually voting on when they went to the polls. And like that, the Netanyahu government comes to power. It designates its justice minister, Yariv Levin. And Yariv Levin, who has a very close relationship with a right-wing think tank that is funded by US billionaires based very close to where I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. This think tank basically handed Yariv Levin a package of judicial legislation that is designed to basically remove the Supreme Court, which is essentially the single check and balance on the coalition government. This judicial package is designed to neutralize the Supreme Court. And so that is what this government set about doing in record time. I mean, it announced that it planned to pass at least key elements of this judicial reform, as they called it, which is alternatively called either judicial overhaul or a judicial coup by those who oppose it. They indicated that they intended to pass this before the Pesach recess. Rav Natan talked about Jewish time. Well, in Israel, right, the Knesset actually goes on a month-long recess that starts with Passover. So the Netanyahu government said, we're going to pass at least key elements of this before Pesach, right? And honestly, I'm looking at this as an analyst who sits and reads and studies this stuff all day. And I thought they were going to do it. I didn't see how it could be stopped. I mean, they have 64 seats in the Knesset. That's a clear majority out of 120. They could ram it through. They had the votes. And what is incredible and mind-boggling and amazing is that the Israeli public, through their sheer tenacity, put it on hold. Now, that doesn't mean it's over, right? It's been paused. The Knesset comes back into session on Sunday, right? And it's clear that the government isn't done. But the fact that it was able to be paused and the fact that the public has not sat down and said, okay, we're done. They are still extremely mobilized. They're still protesting. They still recognize this extreme threat, and they're not going to be cowed, and they're not going to let it go through, is extremely energizing. So I've said a lot here, but we're at this absolutely pivotal moment. And I'm sure we'll get to this, but I'll, leave it on the note that I think we here in the United States have a really, really important role to play. And I'm sure we're gonna talk more about that, but I'm gonna toss it back to Rav Natan.
Thank you, Debra. So Noah, we were talking a little bit earlier in preparing for this, and I mentioned to you that I read one of your articles called Israelis are great at protesting, not at turning protests into real change, right? So Debra is talking to us that we had 16 weeks of protest, that everything is happening right now, and we're actually able to stop, and that didn't happen before Pesach, or apparently, right? So what is actually happening? Did it actually stop? It didn't stop? Like, what is happening behind the scenes right now?
Absolutely. So in general, I want to give some context to some of the things that Debra has talked about, and some of the things that you mentioned. In terms of voting trends and political trends in Israel, Israel actually generally follows global political trends. It has seen a right-wing shift in the last 20 years. It has seen also rising levels of religiosity. These are global trends, they're not specific to Israel. So if we're looking at it from a comparative perspective, this is largely reflective of the world that we're living in. Also, I want to add to Rav Natan's point that actually research on polarization in Israel has shown that there is significant polarization for a while. In fact, what's interesting right now is that historically in Israel, centrist parties have tended to be one cycle or two cycle parties. And one of the interesting aspects of current Israeli politics is actually the consistency and the major role that centrist parties like Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid are playing here. With regards to change and with regard to the protests, during the 4 or 5, what felt like 1 million election cycles that were happening, was that in all these campaigns, actually, there wasn't that much policy that was campaigned on. A lot of the focus of these elections was, are you pro-Bibi or are you anti-Bibi? That does not indicate how parties intend to govern. That does not indicate how they plan to allocate budgets. That is merely a popularity competition on the issue of Bibi in office, or Benjamin Netanyahu. Sorry, I'm so used to calling him Bibi. It's very strange for me to say Benjamin Netanyahu. So what happened is that Benjamin Netanyahu was able finally to establish a significant enough to really mobilize the right wing of Israeli politics to be pro-Bibi and establish this government, which is why some of the actual policy positions of this coalition were less obvious during the campaign, and part of why we're seeing that play out now. I would also add, in terms of this aspect of the role of Kohelet, or maybe I'm not supposed to name names, of this think tank, is that they actually have played a long-term role in Israeli politics. They were also involved in the language of the 2018 nation-state law and have an existing relationship with Netanyahu as well. So they have had a relationship surrounding some legislative proposals that are associated with constricting civil rights, and so empowering certain segments of the Israeli polity. And so I think that that is important to recognize, that the judicial reform legislation is just a part of the impact. And also in terms of judicial reform and the executive, you know, in Israel, for those of you who don't know, this is a multi-party system where the executive is drawn from the legislative branch, right? So people who are legislators are also serving in government. You don't have that separation that you have in the United States. I apologize for those of you who already know this, but the impact of that means that if the coalition members are a majority of the legislative branch, they, in fact, there's very little check from the opposition on the executive. And that is part of the historic structure of the Israeli politics. That's not a product of the recent government. If we want to blame somebody, frankly, we can blame David Ben-Gurion, who was a big fan of of no one questioning the executive, and definitely no one questioning him, a short king as he is or was. And he also, by the way, is somebody who objected to the establishment of a constitution for Israel, and is the main reason behind what is called the Harari compromise that produced what we call now the basic laws, right? These basic laws are quasi-constitutional laws that are ultimately supposed to make up the Constitution. All of this, I said a lot of things. How does all of this relate to the judicial reform? Well, one of the ways in which the Supreme Court or the High Court in Israel is able to check the executive branch is through its interpretation of legal precedent and its interpretation of these quasi-constitutional law, most explicitly the 1992 the Basic Law, Human Dignity and Liberty. That is the one that really gave the High Court for the first time more significant judicial review. By the way, this law was very much supported by Likud at the time because Likud was a liberal party, right, with a focus on individual rights, and preferred, right, a less centralized government and a government that did not control that had less of an impact on people's individual lives. That was historically its political ideology. Its current attitudes toward the court is very different than its historic attitude. And that's like, right, this is not, the current judicial reforms are actually not a reflection of Likud throughout time. And it's that kind of context is important to remember when we're talking about right, left, political preferences, policy preferences. And so I sort of lost my train of thought with all these details. And in terms, wait, no, I got
let me ask you a question to help you guide back there, Noah.
Yes.
You're talking about the lack of the Constitution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And President Herzog tried to bring a group of people together recently. And one of his proposals was to actually finally get a Constitution. And some people tried to come to the table with him. Some people came but already left. Some people never came to the table. How are you seeing this? Is this a real possibility? Is there an outcome of that? Or this is just stalling and in 2 months we're back to where we were a month ago?
So in terms of the constitutional discussion, I'm relying a lot on the work of Dr. Yofi Tirosh, if you're familiar. And she talks about the importance of the Constitution and specifically a Bill of Rights, which Israel doesn't currently have, and the significance of it for gender and LGBT, for women and LGBTQ folks. The fundamental issue here is that in general, especially for those in the Haredi community, their relationship to state laws and their relationship to the court as a legitimate enforcer of law or creator of or implementer of law is very suspect, right? They believe that Israel should be governed by halacha. They believe in the reestablishment of the Sanhedrin, and in general are very suspicious of the role of a civilian court in their life. And so, you know, perhaps a constitution would shift the power of balance in terms of the discourse. I do think that it is definitely a significant uphill battle in terms of getting broad support. Although notably, I will say in terms of support for judicial reform, even amongst voters for the parties that are in the current coalition, significant portions of them are not supportive of the judicial reform. I have the numbers, I wrote them down, I prepared you guys. Among Likud voters, 47% object to judicial reform. Among religious Zionists, 38%. Shas voters, 48% object. And among United Torah Judaism, so right, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi political party, 38%. So in all cases, we're talking around 40% of their voters do not agree with the judicial reform, right? Once you add people who are not voters for the coalition, what you have, in fact, is a majority of Israeli voters not supporting judicial reforms, right? This is not a popular position. If
So-
we're talking about trends.
As you know, with the chances that we might have elections kind of any moment in Israel all the time, the polls never stop, right? So the pollsters in Israel, they are very well financially better than any other country on the world because they always have work to do. And in the polls already, they are showing exactly what Noah said, that even the voters of the current coalition are unhappy. And if that government falls apart, probably it wouldn't be able to get the same amount of votes in a new turn coming up. So I'm
But even
like,
with the judicial reform, this is getting wonky for those of you who are into legislative processes. A lot of these bills are at the very last stage in the legislative process. Most of them in Israel, for a bill to become a law, I don't have a fun cartoon video to give you in an American context, right? But you need 3 floor readings, although the third one is largely perfunctory. And most of these bills have passed the first reading and have been approved for a second reading, meaning that come April 30th, when this government reconvenes, they might be able to shove it down our throats, right? They might be able, all they need is one more vote. And if you are not familiar with Benjamin Netanyahu, he runs a very tight ship with significant coalition discipline. That is one of, people don't talk about this enough, but that is one of his great successes as a politician. He could give Nancy Pelosi a run for her money.
so I would ask one more question to you, Noah, before we go to Debra, but we talked a lot about judicial reform in generic terms, right? But what exactly is one of those laws that could pass? And I'll share an example of something that I read and I want you to hear your comments on. Is right now, based on the jurisprudence that we're talking, that the Supreme Court can veto a law that is happening right on the Knesset or something like that, because it might disagree with a basic law or another precedent in law in Israel. And my understanding is one of the laws is that the Knesset now is going to have a veto over the veto, right? If the Supreme Court vetoes the Knesset can say, no, thank you, and still go on with that. And that's how we're losing our checks and balances. Is this really what's happening? Is there more that they're trying to pass? What is actually this judicial revolution that they're trying to create?
There is more that they're trying to pass, and they are, in fact, they have, as I mentioned, have already posed a number of bills that enable the government in a variety of ways to override the judiciary and bar the judiciary from any form of judicial review of law. So one is literally called the override clause, which allows the Knesset with a simple majority to override any decision made by the High Court. So as you can imagine, I mean, if you try and think of that in a US context, right? In a US context, that would mean that Congress would be able to override the Supreme Court, which maybe sometimes seems like a nice idea when it doesn't go our way, but in reality is a very, very problematic concept. Another bill that they have proposed fundamentally bars the Supreme Court from even discussing the legality of the bill, or what's called the test of reasonability. And they're not just, when they attack the judiciary, they're also, and limiting the ability for anyone to check legality of policy or legislation. They're also targeting what's called legal advisors. So every ministry has a legal advisor that when the ministry itself, for those of you who are bureaucrats, are, coming up with a new federal rule, right? And want to implement it, this legal advisor is responsible for telling them whether this rule, this policy, is legally justifiable and acceptable. What they want to do is make that position be a political appointee as opposed to its current hiring process in a public tender based on qualifications. And so there are a variety of ways in which they are really disemboweling the ability of the judiciary to prevent policy or legislation that is potentially harmful.
Thank you so much. Debra, as we invited you, before we invited you for this call, we invited you for another call. We invited you as a member of A Time to help us think about how we're gonna celebrate Israel in its 75th birthday, right? In a moment like this. And many synagogues, JCCs, federations, the American Jewish community, and other diasporas as well, don't get the day off, are not barbecuing throughout the day, don't have protests to go to. And we're trying to struggle to figure out how to do that. How are you seeing the impact on what is happening right now in Israel in the Jewish community here in particular? Is it something that is being taken seriously, that is really changing how Jewish communities approach Israel in general? And I think there's something else that Noah, you and I talked about, how also what is considered progressive here or conservative here has a different metric when we talk about Israel, right? Some of the most progressive positions here in the US, they're not even thought of in Israel, right? If the most progressive elements of Israel, sometimes they tend to be a little bit more conservative than the American progressive movement. And especially for people who are in the progressive end, have challenges even connecting with their progressive partners in Israel and in the Knesset as well. So how are you seeing that relationship? Is it something that still strong, that one can rely on each other? Is the lobby with American government still happening? Like, how is that entire relationship going on these days?
There's a lot packed into that question. Before I answer it, which I will endeavor to do to the best of my ability, this is maybe going to sound a little bit like shameless self-promotion, but I really do have to share with all of you that J Street has an incredible resource that if you are interested in really taking a dive into everything about the Netanyahu government, we have what is at this point, I think now a 50-page dossier on the Netanyahu government that goes into everything from key personalities in the government, what the coalition agreements lay out in terms of what the government says it's going to do, what the government has already done, and that includes everything on the judicial front, so all the details are there, and also quotes from all kinds of key parties about the Netanyahu government, and that includes Israeli politicians, Israeli security officials, it includes members of Congress, statements by the Biden administration, and statements made by Jewish communal leadership as well. And so it's really, it's like one-stop shopping if you really want to take a deep dive into all this stuff, and I'm happy to share it in whatever way works best. But to Rav Natan's question, it's a difficult moment, and I've never seen anything quite like it in my certainly in my time working on this issue. I certainly have not. And I'm seeing folks who typically, who would never consider saying anything remotely critical publicly about Israel or the Israeli government, expressing concern, and it's in ways that are really novel. One thing that just happened within the past week was JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, held their big conclave in Israel, their big GA. And so you have, big mahafs, representatives from JIFNA, from, all over North America, getting together in Israel. and you actually had some of the delegates there were actually participating in protests, going out and protesting in front of the Supreme Court. Netanyahu himself was set to address the plenum, and there was a real fear that he was going to have trouble getting in, that his speech would be disrupted, et cetera. And at near the last moment, he had scheduling difficulties and had to cancel his speech. And so, I mean, it's really a fascinating moment in terms of ferment. Now, there are still folks who, despite all of this, I mean, it's interesting to see the range of response and reaction. And there is a range. I mean, there are certainly those who, if they say something about the protests, they will just say, well, this too just shows how amazing Israel is and its vibrant democracy, and won't bring themselves to say anything, critical about the Netanyahu government, right? And that's kind of the shift in the Hasbara, or, propaganda. But, I mean, we are seeing movement. We're seeing movement on this, I think, for sure. And, it's a moment. It's a moment of change. Now, let me say this. I think, and I don't think have touched on this at all. And so, I think maybe this is the moment I'm going to raise it, is that what is very important, and I think, where I would like to see the Jewish American community, at least those of us on the more progressive side of the ledger, play, and I mean, most Jewish Americans are progressive. We know that. Where I would like to really see us play a role is connect the dots between what is happening right now with Israeli democracy and the occupation. And these two things really are, I mean, it's not just me like trying to make connections where there aren't any. These two things are, in fact, inextricably linked. The folks who are driving this project of trying to neuter the courts so that a right-wing government can pursue any concrete policy agenda that they would like to. Well, one of the fundamental aspects that they want to push through has to do with deepening, perpetuating, and rendering permanent the 55-year occupation of the Palestinian territories. And so these things are really linked. Now, if you look at the Israeli demonstrations, you don't see a lot of people making those connections. There are some, and I know a lot of those people who are the one, and God bless them. There's, Hagush Neged HaKibush, and I love how it sounds in Hebrew, right? That's the anti-occupation bloc, who are out there as part of the protests week after week with their beautiful signs that say, that a people that occupies another people can never be free. And God, I agree with that. But, they're still a small, I mean, most of the folks who are out there want to get as wide support among the Jewish Israeli population as possible by really embracing all of the symbols of the state, especially the Israeli flag, which is fine, which are totally ubiquitous at these protests, which is great. No issue with that. But at the same time, it is fundamental that we make these connections. And certainly one thing that I think is extremely important that I want to emphasize as well, we have to remember that there is a significant minority of the Israeli population, somewhere a little bit above 20%, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel. The remnant of the community, the majority of which left under, we could talk about the circumstances, but we won't. That's not her. But, in 1948. So, and they are extremely important to this, because if you think about Israel's democratic future, they're extremely important. I mean, first, because they are citizens like everyone else, period, right? But also, if you're thinking about Israel's democratic future, this is a population that has every reason to be extremely invested in minority protections and democracy. And so if you think about the possibility of putting together a long-term coalition in favor of democracy, it's got to be a Jewish-Arab partnership. And that's something that I think we here in the United States can have a role in emphasizing. No, I think you want.
I just want to add to this aspect of Jewish-Arab partnership, and also relate to a point that Rav Natan mentioned earlier in terms of voting in the Jewish population in Israel, not in the United States. And this is one of the main differences between the two centers of the Jewish world. Over 60% of Jewish Israeli voters vote right-wing. And that is almost a mirror image of the 67 to 70% of Jewish Americans that vote skew left. Right, that spectrum obviously is very wide in a two-party system, but fundamentally, this is a very different reality. Currently, those that identify as left among Jewish Israeli voters is 11%. In 2012, it was 28%. Where those voters went, they went to the center. But if we're talking about people who vote left in Israel, then we're talking about a coalition of Jewish and Arab voters. That is who votes left in Israel. And that is something that is very important to talk for the Jewish American community to be aware of. If you want to support a stronger leftist camp in Israel, that requires mobilizing and encouraging Arabs to vote and encouraging their incorporation into Israeli politics and into Israeli government. And if we're talking about the protests, a population that is very obviously missing from the protests are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have written quite a bit about their discomfort with the protests. With regards to the flag, I don't have an issue with the Israeli flag. I just want to set that off straight. What I'm saying, part of the discourse in Israel has been very populist. I don't know if you guys are familiar with populism, but part of the right-left debate in Israel has become, oh, if you are a left-wing voter, you are anti-Israel. You are not truly supportive of Israel. You are a threat to this country. And in many ways, the left has tried to reclaim that and say, we are authentically Israeli. You do not get to challenge us merely because we disagree with you politically, right? And so part of the presence of the flags is in response to this to say, no one side of the political spectrum owns or has a monopoly over Zionism or Israeli identity or Jewishness. But I want to be clear, right, that sometimes when we respond to populism, we can also be using populist frames, and we should be aware of that, right? That when leftist Jewish Israelis are saying, well, I'm also a Jewish Israeli, that perhaps is not always a comfortable space for an Arab Israeli who is still reckoning with unanswered questions about what their citizenship looks like in Israel.
So I want to comment a little bit on that and take us to a little bit of an eye to the future. I understand that because of how politics have become in the past 20 years, as Noah was sharing, right, it became more polarized all around the world. Israel is actually part of it, as Jews have always been integrated, right, with the world around us. Both here and in Israel, I think Noah just said that like 60% vote right wing. I want to challenge that. I still believe that most Jews are always in the center. The problem is where Likud went. The Jews are still in the center, right? The votes are still in the center. Likud went to the right, right? So because of populism, and I want to hear your thoughts on that, right? Because of the populist nature of how politics in the age of social media exist, right? That it has to become a dichotomy. You have to have quick attacks between, like as if there are just two sides, right? And you don't have to say anything positive on your side. You just have to discredit the other, right? And you win the argument. And this is very problematic to any kind of political world, right? When we're trying to talk about policy, talk about what actually is going to be beneficial to our society. And as you mentioned, just to close with the numbers too, right? Debra was sharing earlier, 20% of Israeli citizens, more or less, are non-Jewish. And how many, what's the percentage in the Knesset of non-Jewish members is something between 10 and 15%, right? So they are very underrepresented in the Knesset. So, and one of the major groups, there are a lot of statistics in Israel about which groups are going to vote, right? And we know that the two larger ones are usually non-Jews and also middle-class secular people in general. From Noah's look, I think she might disagree with me on that. So I want to hear your thoughts on how you're seeing the polarization.
Voter turnout amongst Arab Israelis in general elections is hovering around 50%, whereas the average voter turnout in Israel hovers around 70%. So I'm not, I think I misunderstood what you were saying about who.
I said exactly that. I said that the Arab Israelis, right, they are 20% of the population and about 10% in the Knesset, which if only 50% is going to vote is exactly what's going to happen, right? And I'm saying that among the Jewish population, when you look at that, what among the Jewish population who is not going to vote, right, in that 70%, who are these 30% of the Jewish population? My understanding is that they're middle class, secular people, mostly in Tel Aviv and its surroundings. Is that correct?
Not to my knowledge. Voter turnout in Israel is the explanations for why certain populations in Israel turn out to vote versus others is very similar to the United States, right? People who are better educated, who are employed, who live in more cosmopolitan areas are more likely to vote. Where you see people voting at lower rates is what is notoriously and perhaps derogatorily referred to as the periphery. That is where you see lower voter turnout. Actually, if we're talking about interesting voter turnout data, one of the most interesting groups is the ultra-Orthodox, because in terms of poverty levels, you would expect them perhaps to have low levels of voter turnout, but in fact, they vote at about 90% consistently, which is part of their political strength. It's also part of why they are such a reliable coalition partner. And so, right, if you think about this, and the percentage of people in Israel that identify as some degree of Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, right, there's also a spectrum there, is around 30%. This is a chunk of the population. So I would say actually the people who are not voting are people in the periphery who actually skew right. And actually, like, there's some really interesting gendered aspects to this, because for those of you who are familiar with the gender gap in voting, right, the modern gender voting gap says that women tend to vote left and men tend to vote right. There's some differences there. In Israel, what we see in terms of the gender voting gap is that most of that, so you do have a little bit of a gender voting gap. So women are slightly more likely to vote for the left, but most of that is explained by elite women. So women who live in cosmopolitan areas, who are Ashkenazi, who are secular, they are the ones that overwhelmingly represent the sort of left-wing voting trend in Israel. Whereas if you look at women who live in the north and in the south, that gender voting gap disappears, or in fact, just completely reverses. And it sort of makes sense, because if you think about right left-wing positions and being more hawkish, women who live in the south, let's say around the Gaza Strip, or women who live in the north near the Lebanon border, right? Their position is going to be more hawkish, in part because of their real lived experiences, because women are not a monolith. And if you are concerned about rockets from Gaza, you might hold more hawkish positions than a woman in Tel Aviv. Makes sense, it's reasonable, but the seculars, the people you would expect to vote in Israel.
So let's take a look at the future. In 4 days, the government is coming back. what is happening next week? Who wants to take that?
I'd like to take it if that's okay. I know I've talked a lot, and but you guys have access to Debra all the time. This is my one chance. You guys can bug her all the time. She's in your family. You guys are blessed and highly favored. So I feel like I've been the more pessimist of the two of us. Debra also operates in a slightly different space than I do. I think that it is worth considering this moment as a window of opportunity, right? In terms of how we think about crisis, that this is a crisis, and crises are windows of opportunity. And so therefore we need to be thinking, right, about radical possibilities within a moment of crisis to create those windows of opportunity. And in terms of your question about protests and change, there are positive elements to the protests, but the reality is that, in fact, Israelis have historically struggled transitioning grassroots protests into formal electoral politics. And so I think that if you are thinking about what your possible role could be, I think that thinking about one of the great skills of the Jewish community, and perhaps also specifically the Jewish American community, is political organizing and capacity building. And I think really emphasizing those things to help or to support activists on the ground who are trying to transition from grassroots protests into formal electoral politics. That is a window of opportunity in a moment of deep crisis, in a moment of self-reflection. I will leave it at that.
Debra, please, what's happening next week?
That's great. I really appreciate everything that Noa just had to say. And in terms of the moment of crisis and moment of opportunity and taking the crisis and making it into the opportunity, I couldn't agree more. I hate to forecast what lies ahead, especially since I could not have forecasted what has happened in the past 3 to 4 months. That said, my best guesstimate is that the Netanyahu government is going to figure out how it can move forward with its agenda. And I don't see the protest movement backing down, and what exactly that's going to play out in terms of the dynamics. I'm not exactly sure. It's certainly, it's possible eventually that this government may fall, but it also has tremendous incentive not to do that for exactly the reason that Rav Natan articulated, which is that the polls are looking so bad for it. So that gives it very, very strong incentive to stick together and not have to go to another election. One thing that I am thinking a lot about, and this really kind of builds from what Noa was saying, is where we here in the United States, and I mean by that both our government and also Jewish Americans, what we are seeking, what we are pushing at this particular point in time. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the Biden administration, because I watch what our government does on this issue pretty closely. That's part of my job. And we've seen kind of two strands from the Biden administration, which I think are very interesting. On the one hand, we see statements crafted and, put out by the White House or the State Department, who, written by folks whose job it is to write these things using exactly precise language that they labor over, talking about the need for compromise and consensus, right? And saying, that judicial reform is fine, right? But that it has to be done with compromise and consensus. So on the one hand, you have that. And on the other hand, you have the comments that President Biden himself made some weeks back when he was on the tarmac going to and from his travels. And it was right before the end of the Knesset session before the Passover recess. And it looked like Netanyahu was going to try to shove through what I think is actually the most important of the judicial reform bills, right, before the Knesset finished its session. And that was the bill transforming the Judicial Selection Committee that basically would give the governing coalition unchecked authority to determine the first two justices it would put on the Supreme Court, which is huge. Basically, it would give, so, you know, the government, as we already talked about, the governing coalition controls the executive and the legislative, and now they would have a chance to pack the court, right? So that's huge. And so President Biden was asked by a reporter on the tarmac, you know, what do you want to happen? What do you hope will happen? And Biden, right, and this is, you know, not with pre-prepared words in front of him that were written by, you know, with words like compromise and consensus. President Biden said, I hope Netanyahu, I mean, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but to paraphrase, basically he says, I hope Netanyahu abandons it. I hope he doesn't do it. And it was huge. It was so, I mean, it was such a shot in the arm for Israeli protesters in that moment, that the, you know, round of protests that happened right after that didn't only feature Israeli flags, but American flags, and Israelis saying, thank you, Biden, you know, for standing up for us and for standing up for the protest movement. And so one of the things that I'm really thinking about is, for us as Jewish Americans, for us with, you know, as people who have influence over what our government does in this issue, to make clear that what we're looking for is not compromise between people who believe in democracy and people who fundamentally don't believe in democracy. What kind of compromise, like, what does that look like? What kind of half democracy do you come up with in the end, right? What we're not looking for compromise. What we are looking for is a fundamental opportunity, a democratic moment, maybe a constitutional moment that is, which would be very difficult. As Noah said, there are good reasons that Israel has never succeeded in promulgating a constitution. And if folks are interested in this, I recommend a great recent short piece by an Israeli-American political scientist named Dalia Scheinlin, which is entitled something like "Why Israel Always Fails to Write a Constitution," which basically centers around the issue of equality, right? Because Israelis can't get
her book on this is coming out in 2023, so keep your eye out.
Amazing. Dalia's fantastic. So, you know, so the point is, I think that moving forward, can I tell you exactly what's going to happen? No, but what I think should happen is I think we need to do everything that we can to help create that space and create that moment.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Noah. I want to bring one thing that I think we didn't talk a lot about. I mentioned briefly in my introduction that for us as conservative Jews affiliated with the conservative movement, with the Masorti movement in Israel, and our partners in many spectrums, from Orthodox, especially modern Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, and everything. I think is also without any real precedent how those movements are coming together with a unique voice and joining and understanding that we can still disagree about economy, right? Some are more conservative than others, and we would love to have a democracy to have that discussion, and we can still disagree about how to solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? That there's so much input from all sides, and probably we need all of them to come to some kind of a resolution to that. And in order to keep the debate alive, in order to preserve the pluralistic element of the Jewish community that is so dear to us, and the democratic nature of Israel that was founded on the basis of a Jewish and democratic state, right? That's the world where we want to be in, that we need to make a clear statement, right? That we are pro-democracy and there are no two sides here, right? That we're all united in that front. And that's coming also out of a religious perspective from all these movements, and the rabbis in particular are overwhelmingly in favor of some kind of compromise in the current coalition that would take into account, right, people that are not like them, right? When you're just governing for your own, then you, out of a Jewish perspective, you don't deserve the right to govern the others, right? It's a merit, it's an honor, as we see in Jewish tradition, to be at the leadership of the state of Israel, and we want our leaders to take that honor and really use that to think about all its citizens in a way. And we know that Israel didn't succeed ever in reaching the 100 years of sovereignty over that land, right? So there are two major moments in Jewish history where Jews were sovereign over the land, but something happens more or less around the 75th birthday, right? And we can't make it until the 100. And we're really hopeful that this is not the case this time. We have the history in front of us, and we can take a look at that and see how we still have a chance, right? We need to make that crisis into an opportunity to make us get there. So before we open to some questions, I want to offer my own, and then I'm gonna invite Debra and Noa to share as well. What's your gift to Israel this year? As we're celebrating a birthday, we can't come here without offering a present, right? So I want to start and I want also you to share your favorite thing about Israel. So my favorite thing about Israel, and for many of our members here at A Time, you might hear that and say, wait, what? Like, is actually shawarma. And for a lot of people know that I'm a shochet, and as a shochet, as a ritual slaughterer, I barely eat meat, actually. But shawarma is still my favorite food. And I miss every day a good shawarma with hummus and chips inside. So for Americans who don't know that, chips doesn't go on the side. It's not a side dish. Chips go inside. And by chips, I mean French fries. That's how we call it in Israel, right? So I love Israeli food. It's something that I miss. I haven't been there in almost 6 years since I was studying there for the entire year. Actually, I came 6 months later back, but since then I haven't had the opportunity to travel back, and I really miss Israeli food. But my wish, my gift to Israel in this year is for us to go back to our sources, to go back to our tradition of pluralism. I think that there is one particular element of Talmudic debate that I love in Masechet Eduyot, where they're discussing witnesses and courts and all of that. There's a unique Mishnah. They talk about writing it down, the minority opinions. For maybe in the future, another court is going to look at that and find favor in that route and go for that. And it's important for us to take care of those minority opinions as well. They should be part of the system and not live besides that. And this is a tax from 2,000 years ago of our Jewish tradition. So I don't want to offer to Israel anything new. A lot of people think like, you're revolutionary, you're trying to change everything. No, I'm very conservative in that sense. I want us to go back, right, to our Talmudic precedent of pluralism, of really hearing all the voices and making sure that they are part of the conversation, and we don't let them fall to the sides and let people in power take all the power, but rather share that for the benefit of all. Debra, what do you have for us this year?
All right. Let me answer your question about my favorite thing first. I have various favorite things, of course, but the one that I'm going to choose for this is Haifa. So I mentioned my parents were on the call. My mother's parents were Holocaust survivors, and they were from Eastern Poland. It's now Western Ukraine, from a little town called Zhezhane. They managed to survive. And after the war, They were in a DP camp in Germany for years, which is actually where my mom was born. And when she was 3 years old, they came to the United States. Well, my grandfather had a cousin who was also from Zhejiang. His name, he actually changed his name when he emigrated to what was at that point still Palestine in 1947. Changed his name to Menachem. His name was Menachem Katz. And after being sent back from Palestine, this was part of Aliyah Beit, the illegal immigration to Palestine in 1947. He was deported by the British to Cyprus. He was interned at a camp called Atlit near Haifa. Eventually, he was able to stay. He fought in the 1948 war, settled in Haifa, became an architect. Actually, if anyone knows Atlit, it was Menachem who actually turned it into a museum, basically. He had been interned there, and that was his project as an architect. He was an absolutely incredible man, and the patriarch of what became an incredible family in Israel. And during the time that I spent in Israel, and I lived there for a year in the midst of my graduate studies in Jerusalem, I was fortunate enough to have this, family away from home in Haifa, these cousins. And I would go for weekends and I would stay with them. And they had, and again, I mentioned Menachem was an architect. He designed their family home on Mount Carmel, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. And I could sit there on their mirpeset, their balcony, overlooking the Mediterranean. And it was like, on the one hand, it was paradise, because it was just so incredibly beautiful. And also it was this amazing opportunity to be with Menachem, to hear about his experience in Israel, what Israel meant for him, what his experience was back in Zhejiang. And it was it's this, on the one hand, my mother's family coming here to the United States, Menachem making this different journey, and my opportunity to connect the two was really such a gift for me. So that's that. My family in Haifa and the city itself, Mount Carmel overlooking the Mediterranean, would be my favorite bits. What is my present for Israel? I mean, that's really simple. Look, we are in a time when a lot of people are a lot of Jewish Americans are walking away from Israel. And, many, especially younger folks coming up, there are so many issues here at home to delve into. There's more than enough if you want to be a political activist, or you just want to live your life or whatever. You're not growing up in a situation where Israel faces existential threats from outside, and Israel's complicated and it's messy and there's a lot of right-wing yuck and everything else. A lot of folks are just going to walk away. And my gift is that I'm not going to do that. And, there may be folks in Israel who would rather that I walk away because they don't like my politics. But my gift to Israel is my continued involvement and my commitment to Israel, just as I'm committed to making the United States, my country, live up to everything I want it to be. I feel like we as Jewish Americans have a gift in a way, right? At a time when democracy is threatened all over the world, we have an opportunity to be political activists here at home, and we must be, right? Vis-a-vis what's happening here in the United States, but we also have a calling to our Jewish national home in Israel. And so my gift is my involvement, and that I'm committed, and that I'm not going to walk away.
Thank you, Debra, and thank you for being with us here tonight, and thank you for not walking away from this. We really need you here with us and doing everything that we're doing as well. I do want to take the opportunity also to thank Noa for being here with us tonight. It's really a blessing for us to have you joining us and sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your relationship with Israel. And we want to hear from you. What's your favorite thing from Israel, and what is your present for this year?
I was sitting here thinking, I had a bunch of options, but I think one of the things I like the most is when I land and I can go to an aroma and I can say my name is Noa, and everybody knows what the hell that is. I don't have to explain my name. They can pronounce it correctly. Nobody is going to misspell it. And it, I think that you can tell at this point that my name is one of the things that is sort of marks my identity that is often invisible in the United States. But when I land in Israel, I'm Noa, and that has real meaning to me. And in terms of my gift, it's very similar to Debra's, frankly, as someone who my intellectual, personal project is gender equality in Israel. And I do work that is often undervalued and under-resourced in our field, in our discussions. And so I am committed to continue to talk about gender analysis of Israel, the role. We haven't gotten to my role of masculinity. I can get very, very deep into feminist theory for you guys. Also challenging and problematizing some of the ways that we talk about security and some of the ways in which we talk about the conflict and the way that that has a relationship to inequality in Israel. And I am committed to bettering and improving the place that I'm from. And that is my gift, not only to Israel, but as a Jew to the world that I live in and to the societies and communities that I'm a part of.
Thank you, Noa. Toda rabba. Thank you, everybody, for coming here tonight.